Hi, my name is Elodie Bouzbib and I'm a PhD student at ISIR and ESCD, two labs from Sorbonne University. I'm going to present a survey that we wrote with my supervisors Gilles Bailly, Sinan Alio and Pascal Frey on virtual reality interactions via haptic solutions. First, let's start with some definitions. So, what is virtual reality? It's a 3D artificial numeric environment in which users are immersed in. In this survey, we're only interested in VR in which the user do not perceive their real environment. The users are wearing a HMD, head-mounted display, in all the cases that we'll discuss. Second, what are haptics? Haptics is the general term for the sense of touch. Haptics combine two different cues, kinesthetic and tactile. Kinesthetic cues rely on force feedback via muscles, tendons, proprioception, while tactile cues are located in the skin. Each skin component enables the perception of different haptic features such as vibration, temperature. So for instance, Messner's corpuscles are sensitive to vibration, as Ruffini ones are sensitive to skin deformation and transmit information like pressure or slippage. But now, why integrating haptics in VR? VR experiences are evaluated in terms of presence. So presence is the feeling of being in another place than the one we're actually in. It heavily relies on the user's senses, and currently immersion and realism levels in terms of vision and auditory cues are really convincing in VR. Nonetheless, the sense of touch is still behind. So for instance, let's take this teapot. In a real environment, to interact with it, we would have our hands free and we would grasp it from its handle or its base. But in VR, we have to continuously hold a controller, and accessing it is done through a push button. The thing is that no matter the haptic feedback that we receive in VR, this latter is always considered as a plus to increase presence. So the issue is that current questionnaires to quantify presence are kind of outdated, and they're focusing on like vision and graphics. So the only questions regarding haptics are going to be how well could you manipulate objects in the virtual environment, for instance. So even a classic controller would have great results for haptic feedback, right? And more than that, the interfaces, they're often compared with a baseline that doesn't even have haptics. Hence, the results are really expected, and of course, they're really positive. So a novel questionnaire has been drawn to evaluate quality of haptic feedback. It is the haptic experience. It takes into account the designer point of view as much as the user's one. So for instance, it identifies the densities and timbres of haptic feedback from a designer perspective, as well as their consistency, integration, harmony on a user perspective. So our survey also dissociates the users and designers' perspectives. So we emphasize the importance of the variety of tasks and haptic features that can be potentially provided from a haptic solution in VR, and we analytically evaluate haptic interactions in VR. On a designer perspective, our survey helps choosing a haptic solution according to specifications, whether they're implementation or mechanical based, or regarding interactions that need to be provided. So we will keep that structure in this presentation. So first, let's take the user perspective. So this will be done through two steps. First, what is the user currently able to perform in VR? So what are his interaction opportunities? And second, is the haptic feedback that he receives consistent with his expectations? So is it currently integrated? Is it realistic? Does it contribute to immersion? So let's start with the interaction opportunities. In real life, we move freely without constraints. So this is called navigation. It is the exploration of our environment through vision, the ability of navigating through the environment via displacements. So three methods are available in VR. We have panning, which is like a mouse on the computer, like the user needs to hold handle continuously and clutch it to perform large displacements. Then we have point and teleport. So the user are going to point their controller to a destination and they're immediately teleported at this ladder. These two methods hence use interfaces in the user's hand to perform displacements, which does not seem intuitive. So the most natural navigation, the one that really involves kinesthetic cues, is real walking. So this can be done using redirection techniques, interfaces such as electrodes or actuated stilts to stimulate the users, or simply in a large room-scale VR arena. So in the real life, we get to choose what object we want to interact with and do it with our bare hands. So in a real environment, there's bare hands interaction. They're crucial to perform everyday tasks such as exploration, manipulation, or addition. So in VR, though, it is common to use controllers or wearables or handhelds, which hence create a real discrepancy between what the user sees and what the user feels. The exploration is the ability to touch the environment and understand its constraints. So it can be perceived through tactile cues through the skin, such as in this video, like if the user places his finger over the interface, he will feel textures or stiffnesses. It also can be done through kinesthetic cues. For instance, with a grounded interface, the user's arm can be constrained through forces to discriminate shapes. Now let's talk about manipulation. Manipulation is the ability to modify an object position or orientation. So we distinguish two types of manipulation. We have direct manipulation, which is the ability for a user to control objects in a virtual environment in a direct and natural way, much as objects are manipulated in the real world. So here the user is manipulating the cube, right? We also have pseudo-haptic manipulation. So, for instance, by decreasing an object displacement speed, its perceived weight or stiffness can be altered. Editing is different. So it allows to modify an object property such as its size, its shape, and in a similar way, addition can be performed through the haptics, but it also can be performed physically. So here, the user is physically shape changing this inflatable interface through the use of a tool. In everyday life, we're constantly considered as a tangible interface via in-control interaction. So we have the wind, temperature change, we can receive like a ball when we play sports, or a buddy can tap on our shoulder to catch our attention. So in VR, the environment can also initiate these interactions by considering the user as the tangible interfaces. So this involves multiple forces such as tension, traction, reaction, resistance, and we can see here, for instance, that a robotic arm is slightly caressing the users who are then feeling emotions from it. In VR, the user is often forced to stand still, and here we want to talk about the whole body involvement and the importance of the freedom to actually choose a posture. So thanks to the advance of room scale VR, now users can climb, crunch, sit, or even be transported and then interact with their whole body. So now that we described the available tasks in VR, we're going to describe a first dimension to classify haptic interfaces in VR. We use a user perspective and we discuss its perception and his visual haptic consistency. So first, we drew a continuum on the interface's physicality. This continuum describes the interfaces through their degree of physicality. It goes from interfaces without physicality, where the user holds a handheld continuously and where the visual haptic consistency is minimal, to interfaces that exploit real objects and where the visual haptic consistency is hence complete. Between these two extremes, we have like handhelds that stimulate the fingertip, for instance, and simulate a shape or a texture, and this shows a little bit of physicality. The user can also have like bare hands, and we're a wearable that provides a sense of physicality by constraining the user's fingers to feel textures or stiffnesses or shapes. And even without contact, by using mid-air tech, the user can theoretically perceive shapes, for instance, though he can't manipulate objects because of this lack of physicality. Then in our continuum, we find the exploitation of object primitives. So the user can, for instance, face multiple primitives from basic geometries, and his hand can be subject to redirection techniques to move towards the adequate primitives extracted from his intention. In a similar way, without redirection techniques, the user can have various props and objects of different primitives, and each one of them can be associated to an object of interest. So here, the user is manipulating a simple cylinder, and he perceives a torch lamp. And finally, we can use real objects. So the more the object is physically similar to the virtual object of interest without just simulating it, the better the rendering. So here we have a compromise that is starting to be drawn between the user experience and the variety of interactions that are enabled and the conceptual challenges. So either we do not use real objects and the consistency is decreased but kind of more modular, or we use real objects, but technically it's difficult to have an infinity of objects, and this creates real challenges for the designer. So this hence leads us to take the designer's perspective. The idea from the designer point of view is to offer as much interactions as possible to the user. So this is actually what makes the complexity of the problem, like how to interact with various objects. So from now on, we'll separate interfaces according to their degree of actuation and robotization. So first, the interfaces that are actuated without using real objects, they're technically interesting and really modular, but they encumber the user in terms of usability, and they simulate objects, so they're not entirely consistent with the visual feedback, and they either focus on a single haptic feature or they do not provide the right haptic features, density, or timbers that a user might expect. Second, we can notice that the interfaces that are non-actuated usually consist in using the same methods. So they regroup all the visual haptic illusions and pseudo-haptic techniques, and they rely on applications graphism, like on vision. This is usually performed to reduce the number of used props. So we know that using real passive props is really positive for the experience, though we previously saw that the modularity is lacking because we can't have an infinity of objects. So this is actually done in two implementations. So the one that assigns virtual objects to different primitives, and the one that involves human actuators. So this techniques of human actuation has really been a game changer. So the experience is incomparable and the variety of rendering is gigantic, but it's really costly. Like, a lot of human operators are needed to perform this experience, which makes it technically really difficult to replicate. But this technique is actually a result of a principle defined by Macneian robotic graphics, the robotic shape displays. So these are robots that move in their entire available space with different shapes and then predict the user's next interaction, and then allows it by moving prior to the interaction to display the shapes and enable the physical interaction. So theoretically, they allow non-deterministic scenarios where the user can interact with any object of interest with no regards to the scenario's progress. So these are actually our last categories. So real objects and robotics. These are the robotic shape displays. Like, they use objects and they just move it thanks to their actuation. So multiple types of RSD, also known as encounter type haptic devices, have been developed because they allow the use of real objects while limiting the number of props to use, because they displace them in the whole rear. These are the interfaces that show the best potential and modularity in terms of haptic feedback in VR. So they indeed show the best compromise between like implementation, variety of rendering consistency. Like implementations can be largely different. For instance, we can have like a swarm of small robots assembling themselves to render physical objects to manipulate, or we can have like mobile platform that displays real objects for the user to manipulate, or we can have a robotic arm displaying interfaces to explore, or even on-demand handhelds that encounter the user's hand when a physical interaction is needed. So encounter type of haptic devices show the best compromise between user experience and interfaces conception costs. In our paper, we propose a comparison of 4 interfaces. So we discussed a small robotic arm with multiple end pieces to display snackscharme, then a shape-changing interface, shapeshift, which hence simulate an infinity of objects to the user. Then beyond the force, a drone which proposes a manipulation of light objects and displays textures. And finally, we discuss cover, Cartesian robot that moves in XY and provides the user with real objects and large force feedback. So all these interfaces are encountering the user to enable haptic interactions in VR. Using the previously announced interaction, we, for instance, compare them in terms of interaction opportunities, but also in terms of implementation. Further information is available in our survey, which depicts interfaces from conceptual, implementational, interactional point of views, and we use both of the user and designer perspectives to provide information on the different compromises that need to be accounted for. Thank you for your attention.